Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're stepping away from our usual topics, actually. We're diving into some really, really challenging source material, profoundly dense stuff. This isn't just theology in the typical sense. It's more like exploring an ancient kind of radical legal theory, one that seems to govern the whole universe, cosmic justice, atonement, creation itself. Yeah, the sources we're looking at today, they present this incredibly high stakes worldview. The core idea is that crime is never just a local thing. It doesn't just touch the criminal and the victim. No, it affects the entire created world, the land, the air, everything. And crucially, it impacts the free will of every creature who witnesses it. Imagine the universe as this super sensitive instrument, morally tuned. So, our mission today really is to unpack this one principle. It's striking, maybe even severe sounding, and foundational in this material that the blood of the offender is needed to cleanse the land stained by sin and secure the moral balance of the cosmos. We need to push past simple ideas of just, earthly punishment. We need to understand why judgment in this system is seen as absolutely vital for purification and, weirdly enough, for the completion of eternal free will.
It's fascinating, isn't it? The sheer interconnectedness that these sources insist on. I mean, in our modern view, we tend to see morality as, well, individual, or maybe limited to just human stuff. A crime happens, someone gets punished, case closed. But this material argues that cosmic stability itself is hanging in the balance. It's waiting for this really comprehensive justice to be enacted. And we're going to explore how this principle of atonement, kapar, which literally means to cover or to purge, goes way beyond just covering individual human sin. It becomes this essential step in restoring everything spiritually, ecologically, psychologically, the whole created order. It suggests the universe is like actively wounded by lawlessness.
Okay, let's dig into that. This idea of a wounded universe, starting with maybe the most visceral image the sources give us. The sin-covered land is cleansed by the blood of the criminal who shed the blood. When the sources keep saying the land must be atoned for, what does that really mean? Can dirt, soil actually fail morally? Does it have that capacity?
Yeah, that's the fundamental place to start. And the source material is actually very clear about this distinction. The land, the physical earth itself, it's basically innocent. It doesn't have consciousness and critically no free will. So it can't commit sin. It cannot defile itself through some kind of transgression. Instead, the land becomes atonable because it acts like a repository, a passive physical marker for the consequences of sin. Think of it like a silent witness, almost like a ledger. Atonement isn't needed because the land sinned. It's needed because human action specifically, blood being shed or some other major crime happening on it has been, well, recorded upon it.
Okay, so the land isn't guilty, it's stained. And that stain acts almost like a legal defect in the cosmic structure. It holds the evidence, the record of the violence.
Precisely. And this stain, it isn't benign. The sources point to that ancient legal precedent, that the land can't be fully restored or atoned for, except by the blood of the one who shed it. They're referencing those old laws about murder. The earth is essentially waiting for the account to be balanced.
But hang on, if the land itself is innocent, why go through this whole elaborate purification process? Why does the source insist that cleaning the ground is, quote, meaningless if it's just for the dirt's sake?
Because the entire system, the whole of creation, was set up purely for the benefit of the creatures living in it, the free-willed creatures. The sources use this analogy creation as like a perfectly designed house built entirely for the people meant to live inside, citing this principle that God made everything for life, for fellowship. So purifying the ground is completely for the sake of those free-willed inhabitants. The crime has, in essence, broken the ecosystem. It's made the environment hostile, morally unsafe for the beings it was designed to support.
Wow, okay. That really shifts the focus. The stain isn't a problem for the planet, it's a problem for the residents. And the solution required is this rigorous justice, what the sources call gongwi, right? Cosmic equity.
That concept, cosmic equity, gongwi, yes, it's absolutely paramount. To atone for the land, the source really stresses the offender must receive fair and just judgment. And this sets up a really profound, sort of non-negotiable rule of universal equity. Only the blood, and we probably should use the term nefesh here, meaning the life, the very soul or self, only the nefesh of the one who caused the defilement can actually atone for that specific stain on the land.
Let's just pause on that for a second, because that requirement, it sounds incredibly harsh, doesn't it? If the goal is ultimately restoration or prevention, why does the payment have to be the life, the nefesh of the offender? Why not something like exile or, deep repentance or just locking them away forever? Doesn't demanding life for stain kind of undermine the idea that this whole process is meant to be, well, educational and preventative?
That's a really critical challenge, and the source tackles it by framing this required payment not as some arbitrary penalty, but as a fundamental principle of creation itself. The life, the nefesh, of the individual is seen as the only thing that's actually commensurate with the crime that defiled the land and introduced instability into the whole system. See, when a free-willed creature commits an ultimate transgression like shedding blood, they've fundamentally broken the law of the created order. They've basically created this unresolvable debt against the system that was built for life. And the debt, it's measured by how big the disruption is. If the disruption is caused by the nefesh, the self or soul of the perpetrator, then only the ending, the cessation of that specific nefesh can restore the original moral balance. It signals to the universe that the law is absolute.
So, connecting this to the bigger picture then, it sets up this fundamental equation for the universe. Crime stains the whole environment, land, air, ecosystem. And only the life, the nefesh, of the perpetrator can fix that specific stain and bring back cosmic order. Because that specific life is legally responsible for the mess. It's less about emotional vengeance, more like a profound legal mechanism designed to balance the cosmic books of existence.
It really speaks volumes about how serious transgression is viewed in this system. It confirms that crime is never just a private thing between two people. No, it had these universal ripple effects that demand a universal resolution through this righteous, yet severe, but ultimately balancing judgment.
Okay, this is where things get really interesting, because we pivot. We move from the physical environment, the soil, to the psychological one. The sources make this dramatic shift from cleansing the dirt to cleansing something much more abstract, more internal, free will itself, and the mind, or mam, as the source often calls the inner self. How does polluting the ground lead to polluting the mind?
Well, the connection is found in how free will itself is defined. The source identifies free will as absolutely key, right? But it's defined not just as the ability to choose good, but crucially, as the possibility of crime and the ability to choose sin. Crime only really has meaning for creatures who possess this dangerous yet necessary freedom. So therefore, the act of atoning for the land, cleansing that physical repository of sin's consequences, is implicitly, and at the same time, the act of purifying free will and cleansing the mind. The external crime leaves that indelible stain, yes, but the real issue is that this stain leaves traces, like footprints, in the hearts and minds of the creatures living there. It casts this tangible shadow of sin upon them.
Okay, so the defiled ground is like a constant physical reminder, but it's also acting as a kind of spiritual gateway for corruption. The real location of the stain isn't just the patch of bloody dirt, it's the compromised moral landscape inside the observers.
Precisely. Creatures, the sources say, are governed by commands, these cameo. They provide the clear structure, the moral law for their lives. But when a crime happens in their visible world, it's this overt act that contradicts the supreme command. They're suddenly exposed to a contrary influence, an illegal, destructive influence. It's like seeing a successful breach of the universe's operating instructions.
And that leads straight into this idea of psychological, even social contagion, which makes the judgment necessary for, public health in a moral sense.
Yes, exactly. The sources explain how creatures might not have sinned directly themselves, but just witnessing a crime makes them close to sin. It potentially leads them towards imitation. I mean, think about it. If an observer sees a crime happen and it goes unpunished successfully, well, that crime gets internalized. It becomes a viable, alternative moral path in their mind. The authority of the original law is weakened. And we see clear examples of this contagion mentioned in the sources. They talk about the psychological impact of, say, growing up seeing a father's crime, how lawlessness gets normalized, or that subtle, pervasive pressure to just follow the customs of the nations around you, referencing those warnings back in Deuteronomy. The crime creates this moral vulnerability that can spread almost like a disease.
That really highlights the immense social pressure, doesn't it? If the strength of this influence of sin makes keeping the commands incredibly difficult, how can anyone stay righteous when, as the source puts it, everyone is committing crimes? It must be incredibly hard to maintain your own purity when the whole community is immersed in lawlessness, where things like systemic exploitation or idolatry just become the norm.
It absolutely creates this cognitive dissonance that, frankly, favors the lawbreaker. If the law is broken and there's no apparent consequence, the observer has to either start doubting the lawgiver's authority or maybe doubt their own decision to obey. And that's why the judgment isn't just punishment for the guilty person. It's presented as this vital, visible social intervention. It's designed to protect the observers, the whole community, from that contagion, from that corruption. The execution of justice becomes an act of, you could say, psychological hygiene. It's the visible reassurance to every creature watching that the command structure is still valid, still actively enforced, and that helps prevent the collapse of the moral will among the righteous and maybe even the undecided.
That's an incredibly high-stakes view of social order. The punishment for one person becomes the moral protection for everyone else.
Exactly. And the source suggests that if the crime were just punished internally or maybe secretly, the observers would still be left with that lingering shadow of doubt. The contamination would still be out there, visible only to the individual, perhaps. The defilement was public, you see. So the restoration has to be equally public and definitive.
Okay, so this brings us right to the execution itself. If the point of atonement is protecting the minds of the observers from contamination, resolving that cognitive dissonance, what exactly does killing the criminal achieve? Beyond, just stopping that one person from doing more bad things.
Right, and first we need to be really clear about what the death doesn't achieve, according to the source. It's very precise here. The death of the criminal does not vicariously cleanse the sins of other creatures. And, importantly, it doesn't make them forget the historical memory that sin existed. That memory of suffering, the pain, the reality of sin that remains. It has to remain as a lesson. The true goal, the specific targeted goal of the offender's blood, is different. It's about wiping away the influence leading to crime, that potential that got implanted in the minds of the creatures who witnessed the act. The execution is described almost like surgically cutting the psychological transmission cable, the one connecting the possibility of crime to the actual temptation to commit it. It neutralizes lawlessness as a viable blueprint for how to live.
So the ultimate lesson is one of mortality and consequence, demonstrated in the most absolute, undeniable terms possible.
Yes. Creatures must remember, visibly and absolutely, if you commit a crime, you die. Judgment serves as this massive deterrent. It's an undeniable demonstration of consequence that functions as the necessary educational tool for beings who are ultimately meant to live eternally. And the source material is remarkably direct about this, linking judgment straight to prevention. It literally states, creatures saw the crime. They might follow it, therefore kill the criminal. Creatures see the criminal dying. They do not follow the crime. This is hammered home by that mandate in Deuteronomy 19.20, right? The rest shall hear and fear and never again commit any such evil among you.
So the core intent really isn't just retribution for the past crime. It's the eradication of the potential will toward crime in the future. It's like preventative medicine for the entire moral future of the created order.
It completely reframes the severity of the judgment, doesn't it? And this is where the source delivers that really powerful, almost paradoxical statement. Judgment is another expression of love.
Okay, now that is a difficult premise for many people today, I think. How can the ultimate judgment, the death penalty, essentially be framed as an act of love?
Well, it's presented as an act of structural love. The source suggests that genuine love actually requires boundaries, requires protection. If lawlessness is just allowed to run rampant, it destroys the very structure of existence. It leads to endless suffering, oppression, self-destruction, both for the victims and for the perpetrators themselves. So, by definitively executing justice, the lawgiver ensures the community is kept safe from more transgression, safe from misunderstanding of the cosmic law. It secures the stability of the cosmic governance, confirming that its foundation rests on both righteousness and justice, citing that declaration that justice is the very foundation of the throne. In a way, it's seen as merciful because it limits the scope and the duration of evil and suffering in the long run.
We even see this communal aspect, this idea of collective responsibility for defilement, in those cases where the perpetrator isn't known, right? The source highlights the situation where the nearest town has to offer a specific sacrifice for atonement, like in Deuteronomy 21.
Yes, that example is incredibly instructive because it sort of decouples the purification requirement from the immediate punishment of a specific individual. The crime has defiled the land, and the whole local community now bears this collective burden for that stain, even if the actual murderer can't be found. The land still needs cleansing to restore the moral balance. And the ritual itself, where the elders wash their hands over the sacrificed animal, it's a very visible symbolic declaration. It basically says to the entire created order, and importantly to the minds of all the observers, we reject this lawless act. We insist on restoring cosmic equity, even if we have to bear the cost collectively. This public declaration is actually a crucial part of purifying the observers' minds. They had to actively participate in rejecting the influence of sin.
So the community's active refusal to just tolerate the stain is part of their own salvation from that psychological contagion of sin.
Exactly. It's framed as a participatory act of moral self-defense. The source insists that failing to execute justice, even symbolically in the case of a mystery crime, would just allow the stain and the corresponding psychological vulnerability to linger and fester within the community.
Okay, we've established the principle for individual human offenders, but now the source takes this entire legal framework and scales it up, like exponentially. It introduces this critical distinction between the human co-perpetrator and the primary cosmic culprit.
Right, and this is where the true, vast cosmic scope of the problem really comes into view. We move into this hierarchy of guilt, focusing squarely on the original transgression that tainted the entire system from the start. Satan is identified as the one who seduced the first criminal, Adam, and caused him to commit that initial crime. Satan is explicitly defined as the primary culprit, the Jew beam, while Adam is the co-perpetrator, the gong beam. Now, given the law of justice we've just been discussing, that the defiler must pay the debt to cleanse the order they defiled well, that requirement extends fully to Satan. Since he caused the defilement of the entire created order and subsequently led countless others towards death and lawlessness, he too must spill his blood, meaning his life, his nephesh, through righteous judgment.
So what are the specific charges against Satan in this universal legal framework? Beyond just, general rebellion, what's the indictment?
The sources actually lay out his crimes quite precisely, following the logic of the system. First, murder by causing Adam's death and the subsequent mortality for the entire human race. Second, drawing in Adam, which effectively destroyed the moral integrity of the prime inhabitant God had placed in creation. Third, direct rebellion against the Creator himself. And finally, causing immense widespread suffering and confusion, essentially ruining the house that was built for all the inhabitants.
And the sources make a direct legal comparison here, don't they? They insist that since the co-perpetrator, Adam, through his line, suffers mortality, then the primary culprit, Satan, must also face the ultimate penalty. He has to bear the full, complete responsibility for his own sin and for the systemic sin he unleashed.
The justice demanded here is proportional to the scale of the destruction caused. Adam defiled his local garden, his immediate environment, and introduced mortality to his family line. Satan, on the other hand, defiled the entire cosmic ecosystem and introduced lawlessness as a principle to countless free-willed entities across potentially vast realms.
Let's tackle the tricky issue of execution, though. Satan is described as an angel, right? A celestial entity. He doesn't possess a physical body with a soul inside it, like humans do. So how does he fulfill this requirement of shedding his life, his soul, his nephesh, to satisfy this cosmic debt?
The source clarifies that the essence of nephesh is life itself, regardless of the physical container or lack thereof. While he doesn't have, circulating blood, the principle still holds. The execution must result in the complete termination of his existence as that entity. It means removing his life, his soul essence, from the created realm through a proper judicial process. So the final decisive judgment that removes him permanently from the system, sending him to the abyss, the lake of fire, that is considered the required payment of his life.
Okay, and it's really vital here to clarify the legal difference between this execution and the sacrifice of Christ, isn't it?
Absolutely paramount. The source material draws a very sharp distinction. Christ's death was a vicarious atonement, a substitute payment, offered freely to cover the sins of those who repent. It was an act of pure grace, paying a debt owed by others. Satan's death, however, is framed purely as the settlement of his personal non-transferable debt. He pays for his own rebellion and for the immense contamination he personally injected into the cosmic system. One is substitutionary grace, the other is mandatory legal payment for one's own actions.
Right, and the cleansing effect of Satan's death, this ultimate judgment, that's the mechanism for purifying the created order on the largest possible scale.
Exactly. His termination is required to cleanse the entire system precisely because it removes the foundational source of the corruption. It effectively erases the pervasive lies and deception he spread, the very things that have been generating this will toward crime in the minds of all free-willed creatures exposed to it. When the original source of deceit is permanently neutralized, the entire system can finally stabilize permanently.
The sources even refer to Satan by his original name, Hellel, sometimes, and they mention he was created as a high-ranking group cherub. This seems important for context, emphasizing his fall.
Yes. Hellel held a position of immense grace, immense responsibility. And the source really drives home that ancient maxim. Many graces incur great responsibility. He had vast knowledge, incredible capacity, yet he chose rebellion. This intentionality, especially given his high standing, confirms that his choice was entirely his own. It wasn't a fault of his creation or his environment. And so the resulting penalty is seen as proportional to the height from which he deliberately chose to fall, and the ultimate aftermath of this final judgment. It's described as a kind of permanent spiritual healing for all of creation. The source suggests Satan's death leads directly to the fading of the memory of pain, and the end of that pervasive low-level anxiety that comes from the constant possibility of lawlessness erupting. Once the primary source of moral corruption and deceit is permanently gone, creatures are finally free. Free to love the Creator, free to live eternally without the fear of death, corruption, or moral failure ever returning.
So, this ultimate judgment on the primary culprit, it signals a total cosmic reset. The sources detail how this final removal of sin's influence affects everything, the physical, the biological, the psychological realm. What happens when the land is finally fully atoned for by the permanent downfall of Satan and his influence?
We see the end, the complete cessation of those fundamental curses that were established right back after the original transgression. First, the land's redemption is complete. Since Satan's influence is gone, the curse on the physical land ends. This means that existential struggle for survival, the constant appearance of thorns, thistles, hardship that will cease. The sources talk about the creation of a new, purified earth, where the painful, broken reality of the old things isn't even remembered, citing prophecies like Isaiah 65:17.
Okay, restoring the physical environment seems relatively straightforward, conceptually at least. But what about the internal struggle, the war inside the individual heart? Does that end too?
Yes, and this is perhaps the most profound claim. The curse of the flesh ends. This means those powerful inherent desires of the flesh that constantly conflict with the spirit, that deep-seated internal moral conflict that pretty much defines our current existence, they cease to arise. The source implies these desires are intrinsically linked to the pervasive influence of sin. When that influence is finally totally removed, the internal pressure towards lawlessness just disappears.
Wow. That is a truly radical idea. It suggests that future existence is defined by the complete absence of internal temptation originating from our own nature, from the flesh.
It implies absolute, inherent moral stability. And this stability, interestingly, extends even into the natural world. Animals, which were created from the earth, they're released from the oppression of the law of the jungle, as the source puts it. They use that vivid imagery from Isaiah 65. The wolf and the lamb will eat together. It symbolizes the end of predation, fear, violence within nature itself. And this state of universal peace, this lack of temptation, aligns perfectly with the description of the 1,000 years of rest, the millennium, when Satan's influence is completely neutralized.
Okay, let's pivot to the deep philosophical question that the source of material really has to address here. Why did the Creator allow this whole period of sin to exist in the first place? I mean, if hell had been created as something less powerful, the source uses the metaphor of a worm, he wouldn't have had the capacity for such a devastating choice, right? Why grant that initial capacity for cosmic-level lawlessness?
Yeah, and this goes right to the core definition of love and free will within this framework. God designed beings with genuine freedom. The source really emphasizes that the capacity to choose against God's love had to be real, had to be genuine, for love and allegiance to have any actual meaning. Otherwise, the moral universe would just be a pre-programmed performance, not a real relationship based on choice. Furthermore, the source confirms that God ensures this choice is always fair. Creatures aren't subjected to untestable temptations, things beyond their capacity, nor are they forced into situations where sin is either impossible or inevitable. The choice to follow God's love or to follow one's own desires belongs entirely, solely to the creature. Allowing this duration of sin was therefore necessary in this view to fully express, fully test, and ultimately complete the exercise of free will for the entire created population. Everyone gets to make their final choice.
What's really fascinating, though, is the source's perspective on the duration of suffering. It's implied to be around 7,000 years post-Adam, and it frames this time frame not as some kind of cruel imposition, but actually as an act of grace. How so?
It's seen as a necessary but merciful limitation. The logic is, if the wicked were allowed to live indefinitely, continuing to commit crime, propagating misery, well, they would just incur an even greater, more severe judgment, proportional to their accumulated lawlessness over potentially endless time. So this specific time frame ensures that free will is fully expressed. Yes, every creature gets to make their ultimate choice. But it simultaneously limits the overall amount of suffering inflicted on the righteous during this period. And perhaps paradoxically, it mercifully limits the final, aggregate penalty for the unrepentant themselves by limiting their time to accrue more debt.
That completely reframes the nature of time itself within this cosmic legal framework. Time becomes a boundary. It's designed for maximum fairness and minimum cumulative pain across the long timeline of existence.
Exactly. So the big takeaway here is that cosmic order, stability, peace, they must be established through visible, understandable, and absolute justice. A complete accounting of all sin and its consequences. Only then can free will be considered truly complete, truly stable enough to lead into eternal life without any fear of future collapse. The system has to prove its own immutability through this process.
Okay, we've reached the final stage of this immense process. How does the concept of judgment, specifically those final, frankly, terrifying judgments, detailed in the sources, how do they complete this grand scheme of atonement for the entire universe?
The source absolutely insists that the Great Day of Atonement isn't just a single moment of forgiveness. No, it's a complex, sustained process that fundamentally includes judgment. Atonement and judgment are presented as two sides of the same necessary coin. Atonement settles the moral account. Judgment enforces the rule of law permanently. The whole process begins with establishing the judicial standard. The first resurrection, which is for the righteous, serves to prove the absolute truthfulness and validity of the commandments. These laws, now proven, then become the non-negotiable standard for all subsequent judgment. The sources argue pretty strongly that without the actual implementation of judgment based on those validated laws, creatures could never be ultimately convinced of God's perfect love and justice. Even after witnessing the sacrifice of Christ, justice must be seen to be done universally and finally.
Right. So the judgment on the unrepentant, those who consciously, willingly rejected the vicarious atonement offered through Christ's blood, that judgment becomes necessary for the cognitive stability and the eternal security of all creation. They have to pay the nephesh price themselves because they refused the substitute.
That is the inescapable legal conclusion presented. If you reject the substitute payment, you must face the original debt yourself. And this final stage involves both the physical and the spiritual cleansing of the entire cosmic apparatus. This includes, according to the sources, the cleansing of the heavenly tabernacle or temple archetype, and also the spiritual cleansing of Hades, the abyss, these repositories of past lawlessness and spiritual imprisonment. The sources also describe the 7 plagues, the Shiljang, as being associated specifically with the cleansing of the physical realm. They're poured out particularly on the few wicked who remain actively resisting the divine order right at that end time.
So that implies a kind of necessary final scrubbing of any remaining physical stains before the new eternal order can be fully established.
Precisely. The physical domain has to be purified just like the spiritual. However, the true finality, the absolute end of the process, comes only when the primary culprit, Satan, symbolized by that ancient scapegoat figure, Azazel, is judged and definitively sent to the abyss, the lake of fire. This act ensures the ultimate and permanent completion of the creature's free will. The Day of Atonement is only fully concluded when the primary perpetrator of cosmic disruption is permanently removed from the system, rendering the moral environment permanently clean, stable, and secure.
And this final resolution directly addresses what we were talking about earlier, that cognitive dissonance felt by all observers throughout history. They've seen the horrors of lawlessness, the chaos, the oppression, the suffering. Now, finally, they witness the absolute, immutable consequence applied universally.
Exactly. Creatures who have witnessed the entire spectrum from the initial fall from grace to the incredible sacrificial redemption offered right through to the ultimate necessary destruction of those who steadfastly reject repentance, they will no longer harbor any doubt. No doubt about the perfection of God's love or God's justice. They will be utterly convinced by the empirical, visible evidence presented in the final judgment. The system resolves all cognitive dissonance. There's no remaining mystery, no lingering doubt about fairness or equity. It all makes sense in the end.
And crucially, the sources argue that even for the unrepentant criminal, this final judgment is, in a strange way, a necessary release, a release from their own self-inflicted torment.
Yes, the source is quite poignant on the nature of internal misery. Creatures who constantly oppress their neighbors, who constantly defy the cosmic law of love, are described as being fundamentally wretched, because their actions defy the very creative principle of love that actually sustains their existence. If they become so completely seized by evil to the point where they genuinely believe their wrongdoing makes them happy, or is the right way then death, that final cessation is presented as the final, perhaps even merciful, resolution. It ends their self-destruction. And perhaps more importantly for the system, it ends their infliction of pain on others forever, ensuring eternal peace and security for the rest of creation.
So, what does this all really mean for us thinking about this today? We started with this, well, harsh, stark idea, cleansing the land with the offender's life. And we found that this was actually presented as a massive, multi layered cosmological mechanism, one aimed at ultimately purifying the heart, securing genuine moral choice, and guaranteeing a stable, eternal future for all of creation. The process, as laid out, required the sacrifice of the innocent, that's Christ's vicarious atonement for those who repent, but it also required the rigorous, visible, and decisive payment of the personal debt by the guilty, climaxing with the judgment on the primary culprit, Satan, to ensure that contamination is completely, utterly eradicated from the system.
Yeah, the knowledge we gain from exploring this material, I think, is that stability and eternal peace, in this view, are not achieved through just tolerating systemic wrongdoing, but rather through the rigorous, comprehensive application of justice. And this judgment simultaneously serves as this crucial, unforgettable education. It demonstrates the exact, absolute consequences of choice precisely in order to prevent future suffering for all those who ultimately choose righteousness. It's framed as the final, ultimate act of love needed to define the boundaries of a safe, eternal existence.
And as a final provocative thought for you, the learner, to maybe mull over, consider this perspective from the source material. It implies that the greatest grace afforded to the eternal wicked is actually limiting the time they have to commit atrocities, thereby limiting the severity of their final sentence. So given this structure where absolute visible consequences deemed necessary for cosmic stability, does the certainty of judgment, in the end, actually make true, stable, and eternal freedom possible?